All right. So hopefully people will start joining in. And just a reminder that this is being recorded. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you all for joining us today. We'll be getting started in just a couple of minutes, but we want to give some time for everybody to join in. So probably 12:03, 12:04, we'll go ahead and get started. All right, we seem to be leveling off on participants, so I'm going to go ahead and get us started. Welcome everybody to the monthly webinar from the Minnesota Climate Adaptation Partnership. My name is Susie Clark, and I'm a postdoctoral associate at the University of Minnesota working with MCAP, and I'll be running your webinar today. So before we get started, I just wanted to remind you of a few logistical things about how we run the webinar. The talk will last for about 30 to 45 minutes, after which there will be a Q&A session, and I will lead that. Feel free to send any questions that you might have into the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. If they're short clarification questions, then I'll interrupt Krysten and ask her to answer them. But if they're more in-depth or qualitative questions, then I'll hold them for the end during the question and answer session. You are all muted, but you have the ability to submit your questions, and you also have the ability to upvote questions that you think are particularly interesting to bring them to the top of the list. We are recording this webinar, and we will be loading it to MCAP's YouTube channel at a later date, and I will drop the link for the YouTube channel in the chat at the end. And finally, at the end of this webinar, you'll be asked to fill out a brief evaluation. It should take no longer than 5 to 10 minutes. We would be very thankful if you would do this. It helps us understand who we're reaching with this webinar and how we can improve to reach more people. So it is now my pleasure to introduce our two panelists for today from the Metropolitan Council. Their names are Krysten Ryba-Tures and Esch, and they will be talking about equity considerations in climate research. And with that, I'm going to stop my screen share and I'll pass it over to Krysten. Thank you so much for joining us today, Krysten and Ellen.
Thank you, Susie, for that introduction. Hello, everybody. I'm just navigating to our presentation. Does that look good? Susie, could you give me a verbal yes or no?
Yes, that looks great for me.
Great, and obviously you can hear me too, so we got that one all settled. Okay, so glad to be with all of you today, and thank you again to the Minnesota Climate Adaptation Partnership for inviting us to give this presentation. I'm Krysten Ryba-Tures. I am part of the community development research team at the Metropolitan Council. Before moving to the Twin Cities, I spent a decade in Chicago working for a small nonprofit focused on neighborhood change. This is my 8th year at the Met Council, and my focus has been broad, but most consistently working on housing data and research on racial inequities. When I'm not thinking regionally, I'm acting seasonally, either in my garden or my sewing studio, depending on the weather. I'm actively involved in my St. Paul District Council, the West Side Community Organization, or WESCO, and their Equitable Development Scorecard team and housing justice work. And I'll let Ellen introduce herself.
Yeah, hi everyone, it's great to be here. My name is Esch, and I've been with the council for a year. And my research at the council, I'm one of Krysten's colleagues, so I'm also on the research department of community development. And what I do is really focus on the intersection of how humans intersect and interact with their environment, both the natural environment as well as the built environment. And outside of work, I like to spend a lot of time interacting with my natural environment, being outdoors. I really like biking, backpacking, all of that stuff.
Thanks, Ellen. I also want to acknowledge 2 of our council colleagues who are not with us today, but are with us in this work. My research partner on equity considerations, Matt Schroeder, who does much of the heavy lifting on the data development, and Eric Wojcik, who may be a familiar name to many of you. Eric connected us with the MCAP team, and so it is fair to say we would not be with you today without him. And this is just a little bit about the community development research team at Metropolitan Council. It's a large agency, so we do like to kind of talk about our team and our mission within the council's larger mission. We're about a team of 15 people that all come from slightly different backgrounds to this work. You know, sociologists, ecologists like Ellen, economists, demographers, geographers, data scientists. We're responsible for regional forecasts that inform long-range planning, annual housing and population estimates, land use inventory, data development, custom research surveys, for example, on affordable housing production, visits to regional parks and the regional park system, and a growing number of climate projects with other council staff. So we kind of cover a lot of ground here in the community development world at the regional level. So this is what we have planned for today's hour, or I guess next 45 minutes or so. A little background on the development of the equity considerations data set and what is in it. And then Ellen will present a great case study of the use of this data in a recent climate project for Met Council. And then we'll do Q&A. So there is a rather lengthy backstory on why we created this new resource. And I'm going to share just like the shortest version I can with you today. And I'm happy to answer any additional questions in the Q&A or offline in a follow-up email. So every 10 years, the Metropolitan Council publishes a regional development guide, most recently Thrive MSP 2040. During the last planning cycle, the regional planning documents were particularly influenced by a research effort we undertook to fulfill grant requirements from the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development, a report called Choice, Place, and Opportunity, an Equity Assessment of the Twin Cities region. The purpose of that report was to better understand if the aims of the Fair Housing Act were being realized in our metropolitan area, and this work required several specific analyses. Looking at residential segregation patterns, looking at the sort of spatial landscape of opportunity, and examining barriers to housing choice and other fair housing issues. You know, essentially this report resurfaced a well-tread emphasis on the harms of concentrated poverty, particularly the disproportionate exposure of people of color to concentrated poverty. You know, this body of work is sometimes referred to as, you know, neighborhood effects. If you've heard a line similar to, you know, your zip code can determine your life chances or your health, this is sort of the body of research that comes from. So that work in choice, place, and opportunity was integrated into our regional development guide and housing policy plans, and tracking the region's areas of concentrated poverty became part of our annual work plan. And we published reports and data sets annually on this. From the start, however, community advocates and organizers in the Twin Cities strongly critiqued this approach. Once again, here we are naming poverty as the problem, or like the challenge to realizing equity in our region, rather than focusing on those root causes of poverty. Our concerns about that, we heard that, and our concerns as the research team only grew over time as well. And about 5 years in, around 2019, we started an engagement project to get a better sense of how folks were using this concept of concentrated poverty and the analysis that we were doing in their planning and policy work. And we sort of wanted to explore that both within and outside of the council. And we wanted to have this information, whatever those answers were to this question, we wanted to make sure we had that information well in advance of the next planning cycle, which we are actually starting now. So making sure that, again, today's research and the information that we are bringing into those policy discussions, really do frame the policy of tomorrow. So we want to make sure that we are sure-footed in our approach to advancing regional equity. So here we are in the dotted time frame exploring this question. So that engagement project we named Rethinking Areas of Concentrated Poverty. It involved listening sessions, over 24 listening sessions with a number of stakeholders, certainly within the council staff, advisory committees, council members themselves. We also talked to our primary users, which were staff at cities and townships in the region, and as well as talking with community groups. We also just followed local research and conversations that were calling out the concentrated poverty analysis as harmful. Then that was followed by a period of reflection on what all of this input and feedback meant for this work going forward, and then action and response. And part of that response is equity considerations, the data set. I believe Susie will drop a link to the digital report, which really unpacks all of this in great detail. I'm only going to just put some of these key findings on the slide here today, just to give you a sense of what we learned from that work. Specifically, maybe focusing on two of these areas. First is, that the council's research capacity and the fact that when we publish research that has a regional emphasis, it's really important and it provides a shared understanding. And we really took that seriously, that feedback seriously, that our research and our sort of how we present and frame that information does have influence, and so we need to be very mindful of what we put forward, in recognition of that. I would say the other key thing from all of this information on this particular slide is that we really wanted not to reinforce this deficit-based narrative, that areas of concentrated poverty were particularly, were the problem to solve for. And we needed to bring more parity and balance to the information we were putting forward about neighborhoods to ensure that a more holistic approach and nuanced understanding of neighborhoods, and therefore, policies, investments, planning efforts, really need to take that fuller consideration into account. And we learned about a lot of other great things too, as you can see. So again, our response to this period of listening and reflection was really to most immediately stop doing harm. And that meant to us, that meant replacing the existing concentrated poverty analysis and reports, which I mentioned earlier, with something that took a different approach and that had different tools associated with it, in an effort to shift that narrative from one that was deficit-based to one that is more holistic and has a broader set of considerations involved. So that's how we arrive at equity considerations for place-based advocacy and decisions in the Twin Cities region. We get paid by the word. So that is the new data set that we've created. We have an overview of what is in it today. Here are some of the principles. We were fresh from these great conversations with our stakeholders. And so here were the principles underlying the development of this data set. First of all, topic integration. What we learned is that, much like the Met Council itself, that, within cities and townships, there could be a housing planner, a transportation planner. We are topic focused in that work. And so if we integrate topics, if we provide kind of a slice of the greatest hits across these topics, that looking at them together, that would have some add value. So we wanted to make sure to not just focus on housing, but to broaden our horizon here and make sure that other community development topics are included. We wanted to have both characteristics of people, of residents, and characteristics of neighborhoods. 10, 15 years ago, there's, and it's probably still a very active conversation about people-based strategies versus place-based strategies. We strongly come out of this work realizing that that's not a choice we need to make, that we should always be people-centered in our place-based strategies and in all of our work. And so making sure that there's a balance of information on both things in this data set was important to us. Disaggregated data wherever possible. So what we mean by that is, don't just provide like say housing cost burden as a field, okay? But maybe if we have the information available and it remains of good quality, even when we break it down into small geographic areas, that we want to see the housing cost burden rates for renters versus homeowners. We want to see the housing cost burden rates for different racial groups, if we have that. We want to see housing cost burden for different levels of household income. So whenever it's possible to really break that down and not just provide sort of a higher level summary variable, we want to dig in there and provide that detailed information. And then lastly, it's great to have current information, and certainly that's a stock and trade of ours, but we also want to make sure that we're bringing forward historic information wherever possible, that we're also looking to the future wherever possible, and that, if there are trends or points in time, points of comparison that feel particularly relevant, to bring that into the data set as well. Again, it just makes all of this much easier to use, accessible for folks to, take a deeper and more nuanced look at the issues that they're exploring with this data. In addition to sort of those principles or like the data itself, there was also sort of a whole suite of assistance that we developed around this. So we put together a great user guide that does a number of things. It provides just general tips and considerations for what this data might be good for. It provides resources for effective community engagement. And we'll say more about that later, but certainly recognizing the limitations of secondary data and the need to refine and inform all of our work with authentic community engagement is extremely important to all of the stakeholders that we spoke with. And then we also have an annotated list of possible use cases, as well as a list of the data sources and really calling out their limitations too. So we wanted to just bring an extra layer of transparency and assistance, so that folks exploring this wealth of data certainly have a lot of guidance along the way. So onto the data itself. Equity considerations is currently a data set of over 300 fields at the census tract level for the 7-county region. So we have sort of the high level topic areas listed here. I would also say that we have some variables that you're not going to see in other data sets. While a lot of the fields and equity considerations involve the American Community Survey from the U.S. Census Bureau, we've really pulled together data from over 30 sources across all of these topics to really ensure that we're looking at information that is relevant and robust in each of these areas. And I'm just going to walk through some of, the features, I would say, of equity considerations, why maybe it's a great resource for you to look at in your next research project. And then, like I said, Ellen will go into a specific case study. So one of the things that we've added to our data set here in equity considerations, we still maintain a concentrated poverty field. However, we've added a field on concentrated affluence. And the reason for that is we want to rebalance the conversation on systems of inequality and patterns of segregation that involve the full spectrum, not just poverty. And so, we recommend consistently pairing these fields. We recommend exploring how looking at concentrated affluence, adds to sort of a conversation or an equity analysis, not just on, what's going wrong, quote unquote, with places of high poverty, but also, what resources, what opportunities are being, are seen at higher levels in these places of concentrated affluence. This work was, largely, informed by the work that Ed Getz at the Center for Urban Cura, Cura. So he has a great paper on this and some of the policy relevance of concentrated affluence that I would recommend checking out. But that variable is now in part of our data set too, so it's available for use. And we also have a time series on both of those. So not just what the most current census tracts and how they're identified, but also in past American community surveys, how frequently does that tract pop up as identified as either one. We also have information from the Mapping Prejudice Project on the number of racially restricted covenants. We have digitized and portioned out the acreage of the homeowners loan corporation grades. So the areas in the 1930s that were shown to be red or hazardous versus blue and possible to loan money to with more certainty and less risk. We know that this is all tied in with patterns of systemic racism in our past, and we want to make sure that we provide opportunities for folks to bring that history forward. Now, we don't have full set of data for the entire region. Obviously, in the case of the Hulk grades, we only have that information for Minneapolis and St. Paul, and Mapping Prejudice is feverishly working on completing data for the whole region, but we've included what is available and we update the data set whenever new information comes out. On the point of disaggregated data, our previous data set on concentrated poverty really only did a binary. It had share of white residents and share of residents of color, because those were sort of the variables needed to complete that analysis. Here in equity considerations, we provided all major race groups based on the definitions of the US Census Bureau. Of course, those are imperfect, but all the information is there. You can get the share of, in this case, or what we have mapped here is Black residents by census tract, and you can see how that breaks out in the region. In addition to that, we also have 55 cultural communities that we have developed that get even further into that disaggregation. So going beyond just large race groups like Black or African American, here we have percent of sub-Saharan African. This was based on ancestry, birthplace variables from census products. And so we have that information available at the census tract level, and this can, really support that deeper dive into the nuances of demographic areas of neighborhoods. It can help support community engagement efforts and targets, making sure that your engagement includes everyone, all voices that it needs to. And so we have, I think I mentioned this, 55 cultural communities that really get into really some great depth and detail. We also have, as I said earlier, integrated topics. So we have policy relevant data, across those different categories that you saw earlier, whether it's transportation, housing related, things across this. We did not replicate the entire American Community Survey, but we did choose some variables that seem to be pretty relevant to various policy conversations. In this map, we show here vehicle availability, so the share of households that don't have a vehicle. You can sort of see how there's a lot of variation across Minneapolis, across some of these first tier suburbs that are on the slide here. I know it's hard to see, but we also have the boundaries of concentrated affluence and concentrated poverty. And the reason that we present this slide like this is to really emphasize the point that when we were just looking at concentrated poverty and maybe making some assumptions about what all those tracks that were identified as concentrated poverty have in common, well, the answer is that they have a poverty rate in common and not much else. And there is a lot of variation when you start to look at different facets of these neighborhoods. So you can see that even within the purple border, which denotes concentrated poverty, you can see tracks that are across the entire spectrum here, right? There's not one, we can't make assumptions about the share of households that don't have a vehicle just based on poverty rates. So, again, trying to emphasize that digging into and really getting as close as possible to your research question or policy question using this data is important, and that we can't rely on proxies in many instances. Here again, this is just another variable. Are landlords local? We did an analysis, and this is sort of the composite variable about the share of rental units whose landlords live in the same zip code. And again, we see a lot of variation across Minneapolis and variation within concentrated affluence and within concentrated poverty. And this is just an example of, here we're starting to kind of pair up different variables, layer this information to better understand the fuller story that it's trying to tell. This is a zoom in on Eagan, Inver Grove Heights, Apple Valley area. On the left, we have the change in gross rent between 2010, 2014, and the most current ACS 2015 to 2019. So just what happened with rents. And then we can also, add how many additional housing units were added in those areas. And we're not implying causation here, but we're simply saying that, to approach this topic and the dynamics around the rental market, really does require us to look at a number of fields and variables and considerations. And we have a whole, set of fields related to climate and environment variables, which is really exciting to us. And again, wanting to integrate climate research into community development research as often as possible. And how do we do that? Well, one way is just to make the information that much more accessible and just have it all right there at your fingertips, which we've done in equity considerations. So here we have the extreme, we have the heat wave temperatures, so extreme heat events. You can see this variation across the cities. Obviously, in urban areas, we see those higher heat temperatures. And, again, Ellen's gonna pick it up from here and talk about how this data, how this new environmental data can be used along with some of the demographic information and kind of illustrate for us some of the power of equity considerations. So I will turn it to her.
Yeah, great. So thanks for providing that overview of the equity considerations data set, Krysten. And just as she said, for the next portion of this talk, I'll be giving an example of how this data set is really being leveraged to advance some of the work that we're doing related to climate and environmental research. So as you saw in the last slide, heat waves are really felt unequally across the region. And the consequences of that are a growing problem, of course, as climate change pushes our average temperature up even further. And as climate change exacerbates the intensity of heat waves in our region. So one of the drivers behind the spatial patterns in temperature has to do with the distribution of green space and tree canopy. Now, when I say green space, I'm referring to any area that's covered by plants. So on the right hand of the screen, there's a couple pictures which illustrate what green space can look like. So green space, of course, can encompass natural ecosystems like prairies, savannas, forests, but many other areas are also covered by plants. For instance, golf courses can be green space. as can residential areas or boulevards, which might have tree cover or other plant cover. And agricultural cropland is another regionally significant type of green space. Now, above and beyond helping to regulate temperatures by providing shade and evaporative cooling as plants photosynthesize, trees and green space more generally can provide other important ecosystem services. The term ecosystem services is referring to benefits that come from nature that are really essential for society. Clean air, clean water, and biodiversity habitat are three examples. Plants, of course, take carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere, which is important for air quality, as well as regulating the climate. And then the structure that plants provide can also help reduce erosion and runoff issues. And plant roots are really effective sponges for taking up excess nutrients like nitrogen or phosphorus, which can degrade water quality. So clean water is another major ecosystem service that plants are linked to. And then finally, I've highlighted that green space can provide habitat for biodiversity, including the plants themselves, but also various animals, insects, and birds and other critters that rely on that plant structure for habitat. So now that you understand a little bit about why green space is important, let's go into how you can quantify green space around the region. So next, please. And the answer to that is satellite imagery. So nearly 4 decades of information exists from which I can distill information about what the plants are doing, like where they are, how much they're growing, that type of information. And this is provided from the Normalized Difference Vegetation Index, or NDVI, which hopefully most of you are familiar with. It's really widely used and it works really well for understanding what the plants are doing. It's essentially a measure of greenness, and down at the bottom of this slide is an example of 3 images which show NDVI over a portion of Woodbury in the East Metro. In these pictures, darker green means higher NDVI and white regions mean really low NDVI, so asphalt, bare ground, that type of thing. So in those images, the white line at the top is I-94, and you can see that in 1985, south of I-94, it was mostly farmland, it was really green, but by 2005, much of that region was really brown. You can see all that white area, and that was as new development was occurring. But by last year, we can see that that kind of portion of Woodbury just south of the interstate has regained some higher NDVI values as compared to 2005, not quite hitting that benchmark of what we saw in 1985. But what's happening there is the revegetation of developments. So NDVI and leveraging satellite data and information is like #1, a way to track change over a long time span. And it also enables us to have basically real-time measurements of greenness and of what's happening on the ground with the vegetation. So as always, there's shortcomings to every method. And for NDVI, one of the key challenges is that we can measure vegetation quantity, but we don't really have much information on vegetation quality. So that's one important caveat there. Now, another thing that we can do with NDVI, which is really useful, is couple it with information about the life cycle timing of plants or phenological information. And what that does is it helps identify the region's tree canopy from other green space. So using real-time satellite information is really critical here, particularly because of the fast pace of change in the tree canopy that we've seen over the past 5 years. In particular, urban and suburban areas have been hit pretty hard by emerald ash borer, which is kind of decimating the tree's canopy in real time. So it's not a great, or using data from even 3 years ago is not a great solution here. Okay, so moving on, next slide, please, Krysten. So now I'd like to show you the intersection of people with green space and the tree canopy. And all of this information that I'm going to show you on people and demographics, it is coming from the equity considerations data set. Now, not all of the variables I'm going to show are actually being used in this research, but I think it is really instructive to share a suite of variables to illustrate what's possible with this data set. So just keep that in mind and know that there's even more out there as well to unpack. So the overarching takeaway that this slide is showing is that there are clear racial and economic disparities in tree canopy. So panel A on the left is showing the percent of population within a census tract who identifies as a person of color on the x-axis, and that's related to tree canopy on the y-axis. So census tracts that are majority white have much higher tree canopy on average than tracts that are majority persons of color. Panel B on the right is showing that tract level income is also mapping pretty strongly onto patterns of tree canopy. And I will just say that when we break down this geographic information to even smaller areas like census block groups, we can see a really steep slope in median household income and tree canopy up until about $100,000, at which point that relationship stagnates. So there's a lot here. There's a lot more once we start going into even finer geographies. But these are, this is a really important overarching kind of takeaway of the distribution of tree canopy across the region. Next slide, please, Krysten. But to share with you a little bit about the power of the equity considerations data set, I'd just like to take the next couple of slides to disaggregate the race in the income variables. So here on this slide, you can see the 4 key census race categories and how they specifically intersect with the tree canopy. So before I was just showing people of color, but here we can break it down into those census categories of Asian, Black, Hispanic, Indigenous, and you can see the relationship there. Next, please, Krysten. That is not all. We can break this down even further into some cultural categories. So here for Asian, for instance, we can look at Indian, we can look at Hmong. For Black, Krysten mentioned, and you saw a map of sub-Saharan African, but also we can look at African American, and that's not it, right? There's Ethiopian, there's a whole suite of variables that you might be interested in pursuing further. And of course, we can do the same with Hispanic and Latino and Indigenous populations, just really getting a much finer grained look at what's happening in the region. Next, please. We can do something similar with income. So on that overview slide, I showed you how median income was linked to tree canopy coverage. But there really is so much more to understand beyond median income. So we can look at the percent of households that are either in the bottom or the top quintile for income around the region, or we can look at households above or below some key federal poverty thresholds. And all of this information that you're seeing here, that informs whether census tracts are identified as either being areas of concentrated poverty or concentrated affluence. So next, please, Krysten. And only a subset of a region's 704 census tracts are one or the other of these designations. But when we look at tree canopy distributions across these 2 types of tracts, either concentrated affluence or concentrated poverty, the results are pretty striking, which you can see down at the bottom there. So no area of concentrated affluence has less than 18% tree canopy coverage, but like 18% is right what the median value of tree canopy coverage is for areas of concentrated poverty. So there are really striking differences here. And you know, I hope that you've seen a bit about how you can understand a lot of the complexity behind this and tap into some of those nuances and really start asking very specific questions. Next, please, Krysten. So hopefully you're all aware that this problem of unequal distribution of green space and tree canopy along racial and economic lines is a national issue, but it's also a local issue. And here at the Met Council, we are really interested in giving communities and other stakeholders some information which can help them be more planful for the future, to advance equity, to mitigate consequences of climate change, and tackle other issues that they may be interested in. So the Growing Shade project, which is set to be formally rolled out in January, does exactly this using all of that data that I just talked about. So as a super quick overview, Growing Shade is informed by the equity considerations data set, as well as regional issues and priorities that have been identified in some of the regional development guides, and all of these intersect with the tree canopy. So the 4 key issues this project tackles are environmental justice, which is looking at the intersection of income, race, ethnicity, as well as consequences of past decisions like freeway or brownfield placements, or redlining, which disproportionately impacts communities of color. Next. Public health is another issue that we tackle here. We know that trees can reduce temperatures, which is important particularly for sensitive groups such as elderly or young people, which have a harder time regulating their body temperatures, as well as people with chronic illnesses. Next, climate change is another regional issue tied to the tree canopy and green space, particularly as warming temperatures increase the prevalence of heat waves, and altered precipitation patterns can increase the susceptibility of certain areas to localized flooding. So we're looking at how that intersects with the tree canopy. Next. And then finally, conservation is something that Growing Shade is looking at, which is really aimed at identifying areas where tree canopy loss should be mitigated so that carbon storage and sequestration continues. And around the region, different small areas have different priorities, as the summary map on the right indicates. Next. So diving into 2 of these issues in a bit more depth. Here, I've shown how the spatial patterns in environmental justice versus conservation priority plays out. And the legend for both of these maps is the same, and that is that darker red areas indicate that areas have a higher priority according to the issue, and that the benefits of maintaining or enhancing the tree canopy in that area could be disproportionately large and have a positive impact on the community there. So for environmental justice, the highest priority regions that we're seeing are mostly within our region's urban areas or highly industrial areas. And the conservation priority is really indicating regions in the north and east parts of our region, which have the highest tree cover anyways, in addition to areas around Lake Minnetonka in the west. So as I said, this Growing Shade project has not yet been completed, but it does serve as a powerful example of pairing data like on people with climate and environmental related data in order to help inform decision and policy making. And please stay tuned as this project completes in the next couple months. So next slide, please. Kind of in conclusion though, it really is a big oversimplification to think that the data is going to cover all of the nuances and considerations that we need to be considered here. Any project really does need to be paired with outreach. And Krysten has, this gets back to kind of the inception of like this project and why it was originally undertaken and why it exists. And so Krysten, maybe if you want to say another couple words to conclude here. Oh, and we can't hear you, Krysten.
You should be able to unmute yourself, Krysten. On the bottom left corner of your screen, you'll see a little microphone that you should.
Well, maybe while we figure this out, I can just say a little bit more about. Oh,
she's
here we go.
Now.
You're back.
Sorry, you got me, but we lost the slide. I did not have the bar. I don't know why. I'm sorry about that, folks.
No problem.
But we sort of conclude with that slide. I can bring it up in a second here. The slide here about data and engagement. We have this at like the top page 1 of our user guide, which is just that this or any data set is incomplete and inadequate for advancing regional equity, which is a strong statement from quantitative researchers that really love our data. But again, we understand, we've seen firsthand and example after example about, how this can all be excellent jumping off points, that we can do fantastic analysis like Ellen just demonstrated, but that we need to go out and talk to community members, residents who are directly affected by things, policymakers, just a wide range of stakeholders to really inform the next steps on any of our efforts, because that is going to give us the lived experience and that community wisdom. It's also going to give us a lot of really key information about why a particular effort or policy might be successful or not. And so, our data set is as proud as we are of it, and as much as we want to get it into the hands of all folks that want to use it, we really do acknowledge that key limitation. And so we like to sort of end on that note to really punctuate that point and leave you with that to think about. And then this is just contact information. So maybe it's okay to stop sharing now for Q&A.
Yes, let me make sure that I drop those in the chat really quickly before you stop sharing, so that everyone can have them if they want them. All right, yeah, so please feel free to stop sharing. You'll at least be able to see, the panelists can now see each other. So a reminder to everybody, well, first of all, thank you both. That was a really interesting talk. It's really cool to see. I'm a big lover of maps. And so I really love seeing data put into maps personally. I think it makes it much easier to visualize. So a reminder to all of our people who are attending today, you can drop any questions that you might have in the Q&A feature. You'll see the bar at the bottom of your screen, and you can upvote questions if you find them particularly interesting. So we already have a question from Laura Milberg, and this is open to either Ellen or Krysten, whoever would like to answer it. And it says, will this data be part of an interactive map and accessible data layers?
I'll take that one. Thank you for the question. Yes, we are currently working on an interactive tool that allows, anyone who, not just folks that have access to like GIS software to map these variables and print them and explore the information visually. Because as you said, Susie, it is great to use maps to do that. So we're working on that, and we'll have that on our website before the year is over. I would even say in the next couple of weeks. So we'll have that. This information, just to say, is also available for those GIS users. We currently have the shape files available through the Minnesota Geospatial Commons. So we've already packaged it, at the census tract level. Given some of the limitations with GIS software, we did have to split the files into a couple of different slices. And so we have some information about what you can expect to find in each one in an Excel file that's published on our website. So yeah, we have the sort of the advanced version available now, and then we're working on sort of the more community oriented tools.
And just to clarify, those GIS tools are the link that you shared with me. So is that the same one?
Yes,
right.
Yes. This link that you have here that starts gisdata.mn.gov, that's where you can find the spatial files right now. Mm-hmm.
Great. So everybody, just a reminder that that is in the chat. I'll drop it again before we conclude with our webinar. All right. So our next question, wow, we have lots of them coming in. This is great. So our next question is from Krysten, and she asked, is there training available for local government staff who might want to learn more about how to explore, assess, and use these data?
Answer is yes. We would be happy to come and do a presentation. We've done that for several jurisdictions in the region. And so please just reach out to me and we will get something on the books. That's part of sort of our user guidance and technical assistance program that we're offering with this data.
That's also really exciting to hear, because that's something that MCAP is hoping to implement in the upcoming years as well, as to do some training tools. So we're really happy to hear that you are developing that, and maybe we can see some future partnerships. So we have another question from Ursula, who asks, Are there any opportunities at Metropolitan Council for public health graduate students who might be interested in this work?
I'm not sure that I have like a full answer to that question, though it's a great one. I would say that we recently received like a prompt for some of our fellow and internship programs that are available at all levels. And so I think those are being pulled together for 2022, and those opportunities will be, posted probably between now and the end of the year, I'm assuming. There's also, I think unique opportunities as we pursue various, planning areas or undertake specialized projects with particular funding. There could be some opportunities that way. I think that some of my colleagues might have a better answer to that. So it'd be wonderful if you could provide your contact information, and I'd be happy to follow up with you.
I'll go ahead and allow everyone, if you, Ursula, if you would like to follow up with that, you can now freely drop an email in the chat, or if you're not comfortable with doing that in the public chat in front of everyone, feel free to email either the emails for Krysten and Ellen, or email us at MCAP. I just dropped that email into the chat as well. All right, so our next question is from Dan. And it's a question about the data analysis and how you prioritize the data set. And so Dan wants to know how you go about prioritizing the data sets to begin drawing from, and how you combine them, and how much is this driven by hypotheses, and how much is it iterative and a process of discovery that leads to additional analysis?
Sure, I'm happy to take that, Dan. So I think it's a combination of both. One thing that we really try to start a lot of our work with, though, is hearing and understanding what are the priorities and issues for the communities that we serve. And so that informs a lot of the subsequent deep dives that we take. So for instance, all of this work on green space and tree canopy really comes from the ground up in that. Of course, there's a ton of national attention on this as well. And so it's a combination, but we do really like to start with hearing from people more. So that's where we go with that.
Great, thanks. That's also always a part of the scientific process too, right? Do you start with the hypothesis, and do you have to stick to your hypothesis, or does it change as the study goes along, and can you come up with new research questions as you go? That's always a balancing act for sure. So we have a question here that's something that's actually come up before with MCAP related events. So I wanted to make sure to mention this one, is how can these types of analyses be done for the other 80 counties in the state? Planning information for rural non-metro counties is underweighted in Minnesota. And so this is a question from Sharon.
Krysten, do you want to take that one with your experience of the work that the Met Council does?
I think that what I would say is that we, obviously our focus is the 7-county region, but I think that's a great question and a great point. I think that, we talk with, we attend and sort of talk with our counterparts at the various state agencies like MPCA and others that are interested, in some of our data products. And I think there's a great sort of symbiotic, collegial relationship there, whether or not that translates into them being able to replicate or pursue work that we're doing in the metro area at those other county levels is, certainly something I can't speak for them. But there's also, I think, sort of different sets of information that are available or more relevant to some of those more rural counties that we would have, that has to be taken into consideration too. So some of the data that we see in equity considerations would not be available outside of the metro area, but it may be available at that 16 county level, right? Also, I think that, you start getting into larger and larger areas which may be okay based on the type of research that you're doing. But you also may need to, start looking at census products that are at that block group level or smaller, even if it exists, if the population is there to support it. And that tends to start making some of the margins of error on particular variables a little untenable, or at least just, interpret with caution. But I think that's a great point. And, I think that partnerships like forum spaces like this one only help to facilitate and cross-pollinate ideas that should and can be, replicated and applied to, all areas of the state. I think that is really important. Ellen,
yeah.
Do you have anything to add?
Yeah, I'd just like to add that one thing that we really try to prioritize at the Met Council is having really transparent and reproducible methods that we put online. And so, I would urge you to reach out if you're interested in something specific, because there might already be an existing partnership that we have, and we can point you in the direction of that, or else we can point you in the direction of our methods. One great example is work that we've done here in the Met Council is being used by Baltimore right now. So that's just kind of an example of, how transparent and reproducible methods can really help advance some of these questions and some equity work on a much larger scale than just this small 7-county region.
Yeah, those are all important things to consider for sure. And we have 2 questions left, and I think we have just enough time for the 2 of them. So the first one is from Lori and asks, some relationships here are more clear than others. Income seems to be a strong predictor of Canopy. Have you worked at all to explore intersectionality? For example, do certain intersections between race, income, and education show more significant predictions of tree canopy cover? Thank you.
Yeah, that's a great question, Laurie. There's certainly a lot of overlap in these variables. None of them are necessarily independent, right? They're all correlated and things like that. And so disentangling the key drivers is something that we do think about for really all of our work. So yeah, I guess the overarching thing that we want to do is really highlight those most important drivers, and also think about the geography level at which they are important. So for the work today, I showed you how census tracts relate to all of this information, which is like one step up in geography from what a lot of our other research is on, which is at the block group level. It's just that there are data privacy issues at the block group level. And so the census is only going to release information that cannot be traced back to individuals. So I'd urge you all to consider exploring this more, because there is a lot of intersectionality, there is a lot of overlap, there is, identifying those key drivers, I think is really important.
All right, and we have one more question. This is now from Emily in St. Louis Park. So in St. Louis Park, they will be launching a rebate program for tree planting next year and have planned to offer larger rebates to properties that fall in any area with high UHI, which I assume is urban heat index, and low tree canopy. But it sounds like a high growing shade priority score may be a much more nuanced lens. Will that tool be available for us to use?
Yeah, hi Emily, thanks for asking that question. I'd really urge you and anyone else that might share a similar question to reach out to me. Yes, the tool will be available then. This is exactly the intended purpose. There are a number of tools out there right now. You mentioned the urban heat island layer, for instance, but we can pair that with some other data sources to really allow this, bespoke and really tailored way of looking at interconnected issues in our region. And that's exactly the type of that's exactly the niche that this tool is, hoping to fulfill. So I definitely urge you to reach out and look for it in like 2 months' time.
That's really exciting. I will definitely be looking for it in 2 months' time as well. So I just want to remind everybody who joined us today that if you could take 5 to 10 minutes to complete the post-webinar survey, we would greatly appreciate that. And another big thank you to our speakers, Ellen and Krysten. This was a great talk, and we really appreciate you joining us today. So thank you, everybody. Have a good rest of your day.
Thank you.
Thanks for having us. Bye.
Bye-bye.